Lecture 1, Skyfalls, The Kentucky Meat Shower, 1876, and Angel Hair over Florence, 1954. It begins the way weather always announces itself in farm country, not with instruments, not with respect for the calendar, but across a fence. March 3, 1876, near Olympian Springs in Bath County, Kentucky. A woman at a washbasin looks up from lion steam and sees the sky unlearn its manners. Not metaphorical meat, the clouds were like steak, kind of city talk, but literal, looking slivers, wet, fibrous, translucent in the right light, falling in a narrow ribbon that aligns with the wind as if drawn by a stingy god with a leaky paintbrush. Men later say they could read daylight through some flakes, like boiled tripe. A dog sniffs, gives the ancient verdict of dogs on anything that has recently been inside another animal, and refuses. The drop lasts minutes, not hours. The footprint is not a county, it is a stripe you could pace in a few hundred steps, roughly 50 by 100 yards, piece sizes from postage stamp to playing card, the sort of geometry only a moving source in a shallow flow field can draw. If you do the back of an envelope on terminal velocity for protein fettuccine, 2 to 8 meters per second depending on aspect and area, you do not need angels. You need a release a few hundred meters up and a cooperative boundary layer. The first responders are not lab coats, they are neighbors with cast iron skillets and a willingness to taste. 2 declare mutton, 1 calls it venison, all 3 reports are filed under 19th century men performing science with their mouths. What makes Bath County more than a postcard is the way it drags tools out of drawers. Once the local adjectives have been spent, samples travel to the Newark Scientific Association and to physicians publishing in the Louisville Medical News. There, the meat is argued down to tissue types, striated muscle, cartilage, lung with alveolar structure, serosa, the sort of mixed thoracic mess you get when an herbivore's interior becomes exterior in a hurry. Slides go under Canada balsam, carmine and logwood stains separate fibers like a sergeant sorting recruits. Alan McLean Hamilton writes in opinion, A. Meade Edwards looks and concurs, J. W. S. Arnold adds his reading. Scientific American summarizes the work that July, a set of prepared slides becomes a miniature museum of bioforensics before bioforensics knows its name. If you want the end of the argument in one sentence, the material is clearly animal, it is mammalian, and it is not nastark, the gelatinous cyanobacteria that Victorian letter writers pressed into far too many post-rain marvels, despite the temptation to accuse every sky jelly of botany. One of the slides is the kind of relic that still surfaces. Bath County keeps a preserved piece on display. Modern retellings keep the histology intact even when they cannot resist adjectives. The adult lesson is procedural: sample, stain, describe, log geometry and wind before the sun writes its own corrections in amines and aldehydes. The how arrives wearing feathers and realism. Dr. L. D. Castenbein, writing in 1876 with a briskness that reads like a memo from common sense, suggests the mechanism you arrive at once. You know vultures exist, regurgitation in flight. Turkey vultures, Cathars aura, and black vultures, Corygipsa tratus, all purge a stomach when harassed, defense by disgust, weight shedding by plumbing, and a sudden squabble at altitude during a late winter thermal stack will shear that slurry into flakes. Put that animal behavior into March air over rolling pasture, noon sun establishing weak bubbles off south-facing slopes, a light northwesterly over the bluegrass, and you get a long, wind-aligned smear, not a crater, not a splatter cone. It is physiology plus geometry. A bolus becomes a paper trail, boundary layer shear and fragmentation give you ribbons rather than blobs, digestion leaves you muscle, lung, and serosa but no bone. Castenbein's hypothesis married to the histology is the respectable, miserly truth. It does not need a meteor or a miracle, only a single bad minute in a vulture's afternoon. Kentucky also fits a larger American pattern that reads like a family album once you stop treating each entry as an only child. California printed 2 meatballs before Bath County made a national fuss. Benicia in 1851, then an army depot east of San Pablo Bay, saw beef-like strips briefly colonize government grounds, slightly tainted, in the way politeness and weather force pros to meet in the middle. 18 years later, at Los Nietos, spelled Los Nitos in the day's drift, southeast of Los Angeles, roughly 2 acres took a light peppering of bloody slivers up to 15 centimeters long. The geometry, narrow, wind-aligned bands, flakes and stringers rather than pellets, rapid decay in sun, belongs to mobile low-altitude biology, not to explosives or orbit. California had no histologists with bombs and stains handy, decades later Kentucky did. When you align the files, they rhyme: small footprint, big stink, flies who study nothing and get everything right. What the microscope wrote in 1876 is embarrassingly contemporary in its rigor even by today's fussy standards. The Newark and Louisville workers separated striated from smooth muscle, identified cartilage, traced alveolar architecture, and, more importantly, left a paper trail. The Scientific American supplement of July 22, 1876 reads like a chain of custody snapshot. Alan McLean Hamilton's and A. Meade Edwards's notes crib the same anatomy and exclude the same daydreams. The Bath County Museum's preserved fragment is less a fetish than a syllabus. This is how you future-proof a weird afternoon. The slide box says what needed to be said to the rumor mill: biology, not botany; digestion, not thunder; wind, not providence. You can, if you like, engineer the scene to the bolt. A vulture disturbed at 200 to 400 meters altitude purges a stomach whose contents have the rheology of soup with fibers, a non-Newtonian slurry with embedded elastics. In shear, strands align; in extensional flow, sheets thin and tear. A small flock's panic will distribute the source across tens to hundreds of meters. Boundary layer turbulence will stretch deposition into the long axis with crosswind variance that looks exactly like the splotchy brushstrokes described that week. Terminal velocities for irregular, flake-like bits, call it a few meters per second, turn seconds aloft into a ground track measured not in counties but in fence posts. Add sun, and your clock accelerates in chemistry. Amino acids and short-chain volatiles bloom between morning gossip and afternoon flies. By nightfall the field writes its own erasures. The smell tells the timeline: acid first, then sweet, then the aldehydes that teach neighbors new vowels. The physics is not a killjoy, it is choreography. The sillier digressions of the day: Nastoc, star jelly, the great gelatinous algae from the firmament, are fun museum pieces because they let us talk about how misclassifications propagate. Nastoc swells like a cheap lies machine after rain. People who want a miracle adopt it for a skyfall and then forget that it grows where it lies. The Bath County tissue had fibers, not colonies; cells with orders, not beads with dreams. That the Nastoc paragraph hitchhiked across newspapers while the histology sat quietly in professional journals is less an indictment of 1876 than an X-ray of how attention metabolizes facts. Fort would file the clippings and laugh; the slides would sit there in balsam and not laugh at all, because Glass does not find this funny. All right. Put down the meat and look across the Atlantic. Florence, late October 1954, a crisp post-frontal day when Tuscany does its best impersonation of a sky ordered from a catalogue. People in and around the Stadio Artemio Franchi see points of light the way any city does on a bright afternoon, white dots against a bleached dome that are primed brain stitches into a fleet, and then the props arrive: veils, threads, gauze, falling in drifts that snag hedges and power lines, clump in hair, and disintegrate under fingers. Jam jars appear, because jam jars are the American Express of marvels. The material evaporates, which is not how matter behaves but exactly how spider silk behaves when the oils in your skin and the humidity at your face collapse a network built of hydrogen bonds and patient air. A match flame scorches fibers with the odor everyone who has burned hair hates. In some samples a green edge flashes where boron lives, a glass fiber outlier that announces post-war borosilicate insulation, not UFO metallurgy. The university lab sees biological filaments in one set and glass in another. The stadium sees a single event. The newspapers do what newspapers do when an afternoon offers both a sky and a crowd. Angel hair is a poet's name for an engineer's toy, protein ribbons obeying air. Juvenile spiders, linophytes most famously, but the guild is broader, climb to the highest accessible edge, raise abdomens, and extrude multiple nanoscale filaments that fan into a ribbon. Two forces lift them. First, shallow thermals of sun-warmed stone and turf, the secular heat engines of afternoon. Second, electrostatics, the fair-weather atmospheric electric field, on the order of 100 volts per meter, stronger at edges and tips, imparts charge and induces repulsion so filaments splay. The silk's slight conductivity lets the vertical field contribute a whisper of upward force. In 2018 Erica Morley and Daniel Robert took spider ballooning into a Faraday-tamed chamber and did the thing that turns rumor into physiology: raise the field and spiders, tiptoe, and launch, kill the field and they settle like bored confetti. Field reports from Australia: Wagga Wagga, 2012, Goulburn, 2015, after floods and fair days. Add the Instagram-era visuals: hedges sheeted white, power lines furred, 1,000 small parachutes that obey nothing but heat, charge, and an evolutionary order to go forth. Darwin, a century earlier on the Beagle, wrote the lab's control by accident, hundreds of miles offshore and the rigging still clothed in gossamer, proving you need no object in the sky to produce a fall. You need only spiders doing exactly what spiders do. The Florence complication, protein, silk and glass fiber in the same week, perhaps the same day, perhaps the same street, is a gift if you care about method, a curse if you care about narrative neatness. Italy in the 1950s was electrifying as fast as budgets allowed. Borosilicate walls shed from insulators and installation mats, slivers drift from worksites and behave, in wind, exactly the way silk does. They survive handling, scratch glass, and bead into a vitreous glob in a flame that protein will never produce. Bring both to a rushed university lab and you get dueling headlines. The right answer is both, which humans hate but chemistry enjoys. The fix, even at a stadium, is simple: catch on clean glass, dry fast, store with desiccant, flame test on ceramic, run FTIR for amide bands if someone at the university owes you a favor. And keep your fingers off the threads. Your fingers are a better solvent than whatever you think truth is. This is where a skeptic, bored of wonder, says, just spiders, and loses the room. Just is an epistemic slur. The physics here is elegant. Silk is a composite, crystalline sheets in an amorphous matrix, whose mechanical properties change with draw, humidity, and UV. Electrical fields alter launch thresholds in micronewton increments. The vertical potential gradient over a stadium pylon's tip can be meaningfully different than at your shoe. A valley's shallow inversion on a post-frontal day will duct light and drift silk. A crowd's eyes will fuse dots into craft. The two phenomena co-occur not because craft shed filaments but because weather-timed spectacle and biology obliged. The angel hair label will survive this explanation because poetry is a good archive. What should not survive is the conflation of unrelated stimuli into a single father. Separate by mechanism, not adjacency in a headline. The taste for transcendence in both cases, meat and silk, is fundamentally a taste for unmeasured intervals. In Kentucky the interval is minutes between fall and flies, in Florence it is seconds between thread and finger. The solution is boring, which is how you know it will work. Jars and guaiac paper in patrol cars. A laminated card that teaches an officer how to step a transect, write a wind, and take a photograph with reference points. A high school teacher who babysits a freezer and knows where the key is. A county extension office with cold kits, ethanol vials, labels, nitrile gloves, chain of custody forms. A wildlife rehabilitator who can tell you where vultures roost this month, and a polite radar tech who can show you the morning's wind profile. For filaments, clean glass or aluminum frames, flame test on tile, FTIR if available, polarized light for birefringence. Proteins lack it, glass doesn't, handheld field mill for the fair weather gradient. None of this is romance, all of it is how you make the next headline smaller and the next explanation faster. If you want to be funny and deadly serious at once, run what Bath County taught you against what Florence demands. Moving source in wind equals ribbon on pasture, tissue heterogeneity equals gut, not butcher, smell kinetics equals chemistry, not providence. Shallow thermals plus charge equals silk day, match tests and spectroscopy equal protein, not glass, unless glass shows itself honestly in green. The difference between a mystery and an inconvenience is whether someone had the adult habit of labeling a jar. And the difference between a tidy myth and a satisfying case file is whether you let two co-occurring phenomena marry on the page just because they shared an hour. The longer view is that none of this is a demotion of wonder, only a demotion of laziness. Charles Fort, who spent the 1910s building a card catalogue of the neglected, would have teased both camps, the ones who canonize every filament as a message from elsewhere and the ones who sneer, swamp gas, at anything with a pulse. He wanted an archive with room for weirdness and for the tools that wrinkle the weird into something testable. We have them now. Newspapers that once carried Bath County by rail now live in searchable lakes. Wind fields can be back integrated from reanalyses. A silk day can be forecast from field mill logs and spider phenology. A vulture's bad decision can be triangulated from a handful of GPS-tagged birds the rehab center knows by name. The methods do not make the stories smaller, they make them portable, teachable, repeatable. And in a course about anomalies, the only unforgivable sin is to waste a good controlled experiment the sky has kindly performed above your head. The next hour belongs to the same cast. Flesh that falls in strips will tempt editors into the same headline a century from now. Fiber that evaporates will continue to fight jar gaskets and fingers. The base rates are lopsided, ballooning days are common, vulture panic slurries rare, but attention instruments are biased the other way. Your job is to install better instruments where attention already gathers: stadium roofs, fairgrounds, county roads with good shoulders, places where 1,000 faces look up at once and then need someone with a slide, a label, and the ability to say, hold that for 30 seconds while I get the wind. The sky will cooperate more often than you deserve. The trick is to arrive with fewer opinions than jars, and to leave with fewer rumors than numbers. Start with the microscope, because once you slice mystery thin enough to float on Canada balsam, the melodrama leaves the room. In the spring of 1876, slides from that Bath County pasture wound their way to two hubs where 19th century men tried to be better than adjectives, the Newark Scientific Association and a circle around the Louisville Medical News. The workflow was method, not seance. Tissue fragments were washed in distilled water, trimmed with a hand microtome, stained with carmine for nuclei and logwood for connective tissue, then covered and read under low power before anyone dared pronounce muscle or lung. What the lenses returned would bore a poet and gratify a surgeon: striated fibers with Z-lines, clearly voluntary muscle, smooth muscle strips, probably vascular wall, pink islands with elastic support and alveolar voids, that is respiratory parenchyma, dabs of hyaline cartilage suspiciously like tracheal rings, and fascia that in cross-section looked like honeycomb. Where early letter writers flirted with poetry, flesh as if sliced by an unsteady hand, their histology spoke prose, several mammalian tissues, likely from the thoracic cavity of a herbivore. Even Scientific American, which in July 1876 devoted precious column inches in a supplement to boutique lunacies like this, summarized the slide set without giggling. The local museum today still keeps a darkened sliver of the stuff, as much reliquary as exhibit. The appeal isn't that it remains mysterious, it is that the arguments are now visible in 200-micron increments. The counter-theory that traveled with better manners was botany wearing its Sunday suit, Nastock commune, those colonial cyanobacteria that turn puddles into frog spawn-looking mats after a rain. Nastock has been the gentle person's excuse for centuries of jelly from nowhere, and to be fair, it is mischievous. Desiccated, it is a crisp, anonymous pellicle. Add water and it swells into a translucent slab that a distracted walker will swear was delivered by the firmament. But the Bath County deposit fails the rudest tests. Distribution: the debris lay in a narrow, window-lined stripe over fence rails and a corn crib roof, not in puddle-compatible splotches. Odor: wet ditch and faint vegetation for Nastock, volatile amines and a butcher's shop's sweetness for decomposing tissue. Chemistry: tincture of iodine finds starch in plant gels but gives no parlor trick in meat. Millen's reagent turns tyrosine-rich proteins red in seconds. Biuret on a scrap of Kentucky, if anyone had bothered with a dropper, would have purpled you into a lecture about peptide bonds. Thermal behavior: Nastock chars cleanly on tile, Bath County's flakes sooted and curled. One or two dignified men tried to rescue their pride by invoking star jelly and retreating before microscopes were consulted. The lab did what labs do, divided the world by stain and fiber until one of the oldest country misidentifications had nothing left to cling to. The explanation with dirt under its fingernails is ornithology. Turkey vultures, Cathart's aura, and black vultures, Corygipes atratus, spend March in Kentucky flying at low power, scavenging the winter's losses from cattle lots and creek bottoms. Both species offload when stressed. A dog rushes a carcass, human appears with a shotgun, a gust collapses a thermal, and a vulture lightens to fly with a reflexive purge. Defensive regurgitation is not a pretty sentence, but it's honest biology. Partially digested meat and viscera, often from the thoracic cavity because lungs resist removal and get torn with the soft underside, exit in lumpy sheets. If 2 or 3 birds share the same column of rising air, that invisible spiral above a fence row or a hedgerow, and are startled in sequence, you get a meter-wide stairway of falling protein carried by a boundary layer breeze. A line across pasture rather than a blot, a few minutes worth rather than a day's, with pieces translucent enough to tempt a boy to hold one up to the sun. A dog's refusal to eat what falls, famously reported that day by people who trust dogs more than professors, also gets a dull physiological footnote. Vulture purgative is acid and bile heavy, carnivores often sniff, learn, and abstain. If you want a control case far from bluegrass, California supplied 2 that rhyme in geometry and aroma if not in headlines. In the late 1840s Los Nietos, near today's Whittier, had a ribbon fall that old county histories record as blood rain, localized like an insult and gone before a surveyor could finish his notebook. In 1869 Benicia, on the Coquenez Strait, got its own smear, window-lined, flake-heavy, decaying under a coastal sun, just long enough for a local physician to write a letter and a clerk to misfile it under weather. None of these events were generous in area. All were generous in flies. In each, the meteorology that matters is not storm-scale drama but the domestic physics of a morning thermal and a flock's panic. Could it have been a hoax? The 19th century had a healthy appetite for it. neighbors with grudges and pigs to scavenge, a butcher inclined to pranks, a traveling showman in need of free advertising. But look at the logistics of a prank scaled to 50 by 100 yards, many pounds of slippery tissue distributed at height along a shifting, gust-shaped line, done fast, while leaving no cart tracks on wet ground. Then look at what the microscope said, fragments that fit, in scale and ensemble, a torn thorax, lung, cartilage, muscle, as if a single animal had been disassembled by claws and gravity. Practical jokes prefer props that read at distance, offal piled in a yard, a bucket of blood thrown against a whitewashed wall. Our Bath County strike behaves like a moving pickup mechanism and a moving dump, the sky's clumsiest conveyor belt. The conspiracy with the best alibi is the one with feathers. The "Meat from the Heavens" headline, having spent a century as a curiosity cabinet staple, always tempts someone toward cosmology. I've watched men with beautiful suits propose meteorites of protein in exploding herds in clouds. Physics refuses to sign for those packages. Atmospheric entry is hard on organics, tens of kilometers per second hard, and even if you conjured a gentle, low-speed loft, the fragmentation pattern wouldn't obligingly lay itself out along a Kentucky wind line in flakes you could describe with kitchen adjectives. The magnet for speculative nonsense is the absence of an eyewitness at altitude. Our cure is boring and adult. Vultures do what vultures do, the ground arranges their consequences with the wind's hand. Now cross the Atlantic and change your material, but keep the habit of small footprints and large arguments. Florence, Thursday the 27th of October, 1954, early afternoon at the Stadio Comunale, Fiorentina vs Pistoiese, with a pale Tuscan sky so clean the city had run out of adjectives. The match paused when players and Curva alike looked up, bright points moving in a way that didn't obey a planet's patience. Within minutes and then again in scattered episodes across the next day, a filamentous substance began to fall over the city and its hills, thistles, cypresses, stone roofs near Piazza della Signoria, hedges along Viale. It drifted in threads meters long, clumped into skeins that matted like raw silk, and withered in the hand. A reporter at La Nation had the good sense to stop staring and start sampling, wind the stuff on a matchstick, cap it in glassine, and walk it to a lab at the University of Florence. The chemists did what mid-century chemists did on short notice. They burned it in a Bunsen flame, they teased it on a glass slide, they dunked it in weak alkaline, and they tried not to promise a newsroom that the universe had spun sugar across Tuscany. The two best families of explanation fit Italy's October as tightly as any kit on the pitch. The first is biology, ballooning spiders, chiefly Linophiidae, money spiders, whose juveniles and subadults go airborne in autumn when temperatures return to the mid-teens Celsius after rain. The mechanics are simultaneously delicate and brutal. A spiderling climbs a fence post or a hedge tip, raises its abdomen, and extrudes nanoscale threads of fibroin and sericin. Those protein lines couple to airflow and to the fair weather electric field, which in October sits around 100 to 200 Vm near the surface. Field forces add lift to the thread. An updraft of a meter per second completes the job, and what began as a household accident becomes a kilometer-scale traversal. In mass emergence, tens of thousands of animals over a few square kilometers, the sky fills with meters-long filaments that snag, twist, accumulate dust and pollen, and then slump to the ground when humidity rises or cold air impairs the crystalline sheet order of silk. The evanescent angel hair behavior, the way a handful seems to shrink and vanish, is protein physics, not witchcraft. Overstretched silk loses its structure, collapses into gummy strands, and dissolves in weak alkali or even in the sweat on an excited boy's palm. Laboratory flame tests separate protein from glass in a second, silk chars and curls without producing bead tips, fiberglass softens and yields green if boron rides the melt. That second family, glass, belongs to post-war infrastructure. Italy in the early 1950s was stringing lines and insulating substations at a pace that felt like an apology to the 1940s. Fibers from borosilicate walls shed by new equipment and from experimental fabrics in factories around Florence would, in thin slivers, behave like heavenly lint in a breeze. Boron raises the softening temperature of silicate glass, boron-bearing fibers in a hot flame give textbook green. Unlike silk, glass threaded into a tight filament beads when heat hits the ends, pulled with tweezers, it snaps to glossy stubs. Accounts from the two Florence days have it both ways, which is not a contradiction so much as a sampling fact. Citizens brought both kinds of angel hair to the university, protein sheets harvested from hedges and roofs during spider ballooning, and man-made fibers shaken loose from insulators or industrial sources. A single explanation would flatter a skeptic: the mixed bag insults everyone's desire for a clean narrative and therefore is correct. But what about the objects above the pitch? The stadium geometry helps nobody. A pale sky erases contrast, points of light with no background edges maximize a visual phenomenon aviators know too well, autokinesis, the illusion of motion in a small source seen against uniform field. Angular rate, the thing your brain turns into speed, collapses when there are no trees or buildings to frame it. Two aircraft in loose formation, civilian or military, echeloned by a few degrees on a clear day, will fuse at naked eye resolution into a single shape. A stadium full of adrenalized eyes will supply the connecting lines and call it a craft. When the match pauses and tens of thousands look up together, contagion does the rest. It doesn't require gullibility, it requires rods in retinas and the physics of gaze holding. The most honest sentence to write about the 27th of October sky is that Florence saw points behave like points do, and then a city primed by a decade of flying saucer headlines did anthropology on itself. Angel hair is not a Florentine invention. 2 years earlier, in October 1952, Oloron Sainte-Marie in southwestern France printed its own miracle in regional papers, cigars, in the sky, and threads that fell like the combings of some celestial animal, collected on hedgerows and roofs and then shriveling into nothing on contact. France in 52 was an incubator for such reports. The UFO wave prowled the autumn boreal latitudes with all the discipline of rumor, and the filaments likely bore the same mixed parentage Florence would later bottle. Gossamer from ballooning spiders under a clear high-pressure dome and, here and there, fibers from a country learning to electrify and to upholster with plastics. The constant in every account worth rereading is the transient, stuff you can catch for an hour becomes nothing by evening. One cannot talk about silk without quantifying how implausibly good it is at pretending to be air. Dry spider silk runs to diameters of hundreds of nanometers for the ballooning lines. Its density near 1.3 g cm3 makes it look heavy, but you are lifting thread, not rod, and the surface-to-volume ratio conspires with electrostatic forces to turn a breath into an elevator. A fair-weather field of ~150 Vm produces force on a charged or polarizable fiber measurable with an undergraduate torsion balance. A 1 meter per second updraft, common over sun-warmed grass, is enough to loft a strand beyond your roofline before you can find the camera, and a laminar breeze at 3 to 5 meters per second will pull out kilometers of thread from a mass emergence as neatly as a weaver pulls weft. Electric field sensitivity in spiders is no longer a conjecture whispered around field stations. Controlled experiments show posture changes in response to modest fields, and departures synchronized with electric spikes in the boundary layer. The field does not negate wind, it sweetens it. Florence's October delivered both. If you insist on a space-age flourish, the glass fiber evidence obliges. Borosilicate walls, used in mid-century insulators and in HVAC, shed webs of fibers in handling and installation, especially when early binders aged and embrittled. A factory-stack towline flexing in a gust would give a localized fall of glitter across a few blocks. A truckload of insulation undone by a careless tie could salt a roadside in a trail a child would swear had fallen from the sun. In both cases the geometry is the same as our Kentucky stripe, narrow, aligned with wind, more art installation than storm. The difference is tactile. Glass itches and cuts, silk clings and vanishes. A city can host both on the same Tuesday. Conspiracy theories, like silk, love to cling. In Florence the UFO frame arrived with the decade, a European echo of American saucer summers, and it offered everything biology and glass refused to: intention, technology, a father you can curse or adore. The angel hair, accredited by UFO literature, is often recast as debris from propulsion. The stadium becomes theater, not coincidence. That story has detractors with lab coats and partisans with mimeographed newsletters, but both underestimate the human appetite for an explanation that flatters the witness. Anomalistics as an adult sport asks less piety from everyone. It says, keep the eyewitness accounts because they are timestamps and azimuths, keep the lab work because it tells you whether a strand beads or chars, keep the weather archive because ballooning loves a pressure ridge, keep a file on every factory that installed insulators that autumn. Then chant the mantra of mechanism. For Kentucky, bird behavior, boundary layer wind, and visceral chemistry explain a morning's gore. Anatomy on prepared slides shuts the door on pond scum. For Tuscany, spider silk and industrial fibers share a sky. Visual illusions on a pale day tell you why a match paused. What would a modern rerun look like if Florence obliged us next October? 2 synchronized high-frame rate cameras on a 600-meter baseline would triangulate the lights and nail their altitude and separation. A handheld spectroscope pointed at a filament would sort silks blackening from glasses softening by the second light of a Bunsen. A voltmeter on a fence post would log fair weather field variations when threads rise. A citizen with an ADSB receiver would subtract aircraft with a homework assignment's delight. The best part of the 1954 case is that it does not require anyone to be wrong to be interesting. The memory of a match halted in a sky full of little suns can coexist with a jar of threads that smell faintly of protein and go to nothing on a tongue of flame. Wonder doesn't have to break under a microtome. It can survive as the last 5% you keep in reserve even after the stains dry and the borosilicate beads up green. Let's stop treating the 1876 Kentucky meat shower as a single freak page ripped from Nature's Ledger and read it as a genre with recurring characters, overconfident editors, pious farmhands, disgusted physicians, and carrion birds with the aerodynamic decency to vomit when physics asks politely. After the Bath County fall on Friday, March 3rd, the newspapers did what newspapers do. The New York Times ran its deadpan, flesh descended from the heavens. A week later, the Louisville Commercial draped adjectives over measurement. Scientific American sniffed, then sharpened its knife. Samples moved the way 19th century facts move, by train and ego. Dr. A. Mead Edwards, a histologist with the Newark Scientific Association who knew the difference between adipose seen through a microscope and a poet's metaphor, examined shreds and said, lung tissue, maybe horse, not beef, not cosmic charcuterie. J. W. S. Arnold in Mount Sterling said cartilage and connective tissue. A chemist named Leopold Brandis peered and pronounced, Nastark, the jelly-like cyanobacterial mats that swell after rains and impersonate meteorological miracles. Other analysts in Kentucky, including Robert Peter at Transylvania University in Lexington, said the samples were plainly animal and plainly not plant. That is not a squabble over adjectives. That is a lab fight about structure. Striated muscle fibers at 400 times don't look like cyanobacteria under any illumination, and boiled collagen doesn't become green peas just because the metaphor wants it. The mechanism that fits the microscopy and the geometry is field biology, not sky theology. Vultures, Cathartes aura, turkey, and Corygyps atratus, black, regurgitate when alarmed, when heavy, and when one of them starts a chain reaction of, oh God we're too full to fly that thermal. That is not folklore. It's the digestive half of a flight plan. A cruising vulture at 300 to 600 mAgl in a light northerly can vomit partially digested tissue the size witnesses described, roughly 2 to 5 centimeters across, flabby rectangles with fat marbling, and if a small kettle of birds does it at once, say one bird startles, dumps ballast, the rest copy, the full pattern matches perfectly, a loosely elliptical footprint on the ground, tens of meters by 100, with pieces that look fresh, where gastric acids had not had time to denature the proteins, and other bits that look like tough rind because retching is a selection mechanism. The why at 11 in the morning ends up meteorological. That's when updrafts over a plowed field in early March in central Kentucky become useful elevators, and when scavengers that had breakfast find out the sky can be a stomach coach. The why horse lung is the part city readers forget. Dead horses were 20th century municipal waste, 19th century roadkill, and year-round vulture buffet. If two birds tear into thoracic cavity first, as vultures do, the contents aloft look like the descriptions, pink, alveolate, and on a good day still lamenting Boyle's law. But the Bath County episode didn't arrive into a vacuum. It walked into a file cabinet already full of Skyfalls that were either biology misplaced or physics misunderstood. In 1869, Los Nietos, California reported a blood rain that a local doctor, given any lens at all, would have recognized as an algal bloom aerosolized and wrung out by a school line. Microscopic spores tint water reddish as they hydrate on contact, and newspapers print blood, because Trentipolia spores won't make a child cry at breakfast. 2 summers in the early 1870s saw Kansas and Missouri farmers writing that frogs fell by the pitchforkful. American naturalist politely suggested waterspouts. A handful of clergymen suggested God. Nobody walked the wind field with an anemometer and a map because budgets didn't yet love that kind of boredom. In 1894, Bath, England claimed jelly fell from a clear sky, the famous star jelly case that nature summarized with a straight face, then watched as samples liquefied in jars because Nastark and its gelatinous cousins are master illusionists. They swell, they look extraterrestrial, and then they go to pieces like a lie in sunlight. This is the taxonomy. Biological scraps flung by animals or wind, algal spores misread as sky bleeding, gelatinous mats acting like the world's least appetizing popcorn, and editors doing trigonometry with adjectives. If you want the Bath County meat to be anything other than vultures, you must pay every bill. You must explain coherent tissue without bones or skin. Vultures choose the spatial pattern, birds fly in circles, waterspouts don't harvest long lobes from a butcher's table, the timing, thermals plus digestion, and the failure of every plant-based hypothesis under a microscope. You also need to explain how, in a century full of real, blood rains, caused by Saharan dust and spores, the only time respectable microscopists said, alveoli, in a Kentucky field was the Friday that somebody's horse fed a species whose anti-predator trick is jetting its lunch onto the world's worst target, gravity. Biology has an economy. So does embarrassment. A vulture squad's ballistic disdain turns out to be the neatest line from sky to yard. Shift continents and 78 years and we trade protein for thread. Florence, Wednesday, October 27, 1954, around 2:20 in the afternoon, a friendly derby between ACF Fiorentina and Pistoiese at the Stadio Comunale, today's Artemio Franchi, turns from football into astronomy when thousands look up and point. Players stop. The crowd, estimates run to 10,000 in contemporary accounts because newspapers love integers with zeros, watches spindle-like objects, some say cigars, some spools, move slowly in the bright Tuscan sky. Minutes later, angel hair begins to fall, silky, cottony filaments that drift, drape, and, crucially, disintegrate when handled. Giorgio Bettini at La Nation gathers strands on a twig, stuffs a sample in a jar, phones a chemist, more samples end up under a microscope at the University of Florence. One analyst says the threads behave like fused glass wool, silica, calcium, boron, magnesium in suspicious proportions. Another says the material's proteinous, like spider silk. A third says it vanishes at the touch of an index finger because the oils on your skin persuade the strands to collapse. You don't need alchemy, only capillarity and hubris. The public does what the public does, it fuses the aerial objects and the falling filaments into a single father, names it UFOs, and gives Florence a mid-century legend that still rents space in conferences. The physics of angel hair has two proud parents, arachnids and optics. Ballooning spiders, especially Linophiidae, the sheet weavers that own European autumn, ride the atmosphere the way clever investors ride sloppy markets. When ground warms after a crisp morning, convective plumes rise, a spider anchors, raises its abdomen, and lets electrostatically charged silk lines pay out. The Fairweather vertical electric field over land, tilde 100 VM on a dry afternoon, surging into kilovolts per meter near disturbed weather, tugs on charged threads, reducing effective weight. Gusts and updrafts do the rest. Erica Morley and Daniel Roberts showed in 2018 that spiders' sensory hairs register field changes and trigger ballooning without wind. A centuries field naturalists watched mass dispersal events after cold fronts and wrote in diaries that looked like poems choked by numbers. The visual part is a trick of radiative transfer. Long, thin dielectric fibers in sunlight present bright forward-scattering phases, so a web you would swear is glowing on its own, is in different sunlight bent by geometry. A city sees silver. A stadium says, miracle. A reporter says analysis to follow, then moves on to the politics page because budgets only sometimes love a mass of silk. What about Florence's laboratory notes that mention silicon and boron like a recipe for Pyrex? There are three sobering options. First, the sample was contaminated, fiberglass insulation fibers shed by human construction or by something as prosaic as a truck bed lined with mineral wool can end up in air on a dry October day. You collect with a bare hand, you write angel hair on the envelope, your microscope loves a story you already told it. Second, the sample's chemistry was misread, thin organic fibers that have picked up dust rich in silica and carbonate from stucco and street behave like the world's least interesting Christmas tinsel. Third, and this is the most likely in mixed reports, there were two things in the air, spider silk in broad daylight and, hours later, a localized release of fibrous junk, insulation, industrial filament, a demolition shed by gusts, that citizens conflate because our memory system is a champion of compression algorithms. If you want the UFO engine byproduct interpretation, you inherit a burden of proof measured in spectra, not adjectives. Spider silk under FTIR is a protein signature with sharp amide 1 and 2 bands. Glass fiber is silica with broad stretches and no protein fingerprint at all. A few grams of material, one cheap spectrometer, and your romance either collapses into a lab laugh or graduates into a better story. Florence got a lot of heat and very little spectroscopy. France had toured this theatre 2 autumns earlier. On October 17, 1952, Oller and St. Marie reported luminous cigars escorted by small spheres sliding across a high blue, a rain of filaments draped roofs and telegraph lines. A schoolteacher gathered handfuls, and chemists said, silicious. 10 days later at nearby Gaolac, the same. The French press drew the obvious lines between the cigar things, the filaments, and Mondayu. Arachnologists, with the patience of people who have counted legs for a living, said, mass ballooning, pointed to the season and the weather, and went back to specimens. The episode reads like a rehearsal for Florence, aerial misperception, migrating geese at high altitude, sundogs, aircraft in a shallow inversion, plus gossamer. The threads disappear on touch because proteins plus solvents, skin oils, ethanol, plus tensile collapse equals vanishing act. A jar seals your prize more like a morgue than a miracle. If you need a country outside Europe, Australia will host you. In May 2015, Goulburn in New South Wales got draped in angel hair, a single cool season day after a front, with local arachnologists explaining the timing and farmers explaining the texture. Their paddocks turned to lace by billions of spiders that didn't ask anyone's permission. The cranks will ask for radioactivity because that's what mid-century cranks did. Geiger counters do click on many things at close range, pottery with uranium glazes, granite countertops, your friend's radium paint watch passed down from a grandfather who worked at a shipyard. But a few counts above background near spider silk in 1954 proves only that instruments taken outdoors behave like instruments in the outdoors. You want to datum? Calibrate. Take background by time of day and weather. Measure a control sample of known nylon and known glass fiber collected from an office. Then bring in your spider mats. The angel hair glows claim has a cure. Put the filaments in a dark box, watch for chemiluminescence or triboluminescence under tension. Spider silk will not light except by romantic metaphor. Glass will only glows when you point a lamp at it. The only consistent light in these files is the sun, and it has an alibi named Maxwell. Back to meat, because late Victorian America wasn't done with flesh and the sky. Newspaper morgues list a handful of lesser, mostly regional, meat showers, in the 1870s and 1880s, a few in Ohio, a rumor in Tennessee, pressured into significance by editors desperate for copy, and each time a rural doctor with a microscope describes structures any modern veterinary pathologist would confirm. The outliers are not new physics, they're new sampling, vultures again, occasionally corvids dropping carrion under harassment, once or twice, hunters cleaning a kill in brush upwind of a village at just the wrong time, the way a roadside deer starts an urban legend when rain arrives 10 minutes later. American 19th century papers also wrote periodic, honey showers, aphid honeydew under temperature inversion paints carriages and tempers, blood on the snow, Chlamydomonas nivalis blooms turning alpine drifts watermelon red, described by Arctic naturalists at least since the 1818 Ross expedition, and falling hair, caterpillar silk after a gypsy moth hatch. The theme isn't nonsense, it's misclassification. The instruments we own, eyes. Rumor, and a page of column inches, are brilliant at writing allegory and incompetent at distinguishing collagen from cyanobacteria without help. Now watch how the two stories, meat and angel hair, share a playbook. First, both recruit, from clear skies. That phrase is a liar. A lofted cluster of silk drapes a stadium on a sunny afternoon after a cold front, not during a thunderstorm. A vulture kettle vomits on an 11 a.m. thermal, not a rainy midnight. Clear means I wasn't looking west, where the sky had texture. Second, both compile into one all-father, UFOs for threads, God or the devil for meat. The habit is understandable, cognitive load is expensive, one cause is a saleable headline. Third, both generate laboratory overreach. If you take a dirty thread to a busy chemist who runs a fast USH test, any carbonate dust becomes calcium, any glass fragment becomes silicate, any trace of boron from street grime reads fiberglass, and someone's cousin starts talking about propulsion exhausts. If you bring a rotting shred to a doctor with a poor microtome, desiccation artifacts can turn anisotropic into plant, and chromatic stains into algae. The cure is method, not mockery. Prepare cross-sections, run FDIR, check for amino acid profiles, sequence DNA if your budget believes you. Look for collagen's hydroxyproline signature and for beta sheet dominate peaks in spider fibroins. 1876 didn't have that. 1954 barely had the first wave of polymer chemistry. We have them now. Time to use them. Let's do the field mechanics the way we'd write it in a lab notebook for 1954 Florence if the budget angels favored us. Begin with weather. Pull the synoptic charts. October in Tuscany after a front usually gives you crisp air, light northerlies aloft, a strong surface-to-air temperature contrast by early afternoon, and stratified layers that behave like optical mixers. Confirm with radiosonde data from Pratica di Mare or an equivalent coastal station for 12Z and 18Z, vertical temperature gradient, relative humidity at 900 to 800 MB, wind shear from 0 to 2 kilometers. Next, get spider ecology on the page. Lignophiidae ballooning peaks in October-November in central Italy. Agricultural margins around Florence, including the Arno's floodplain, generate vast source populations when fields are cut. The stadium itself offers a dark surface for convection and tall structure for snagging silk. Instrument: 2 all-sky cameras, 1 spectrometer pointing at the sun to catch coronas if thin cirrus tries to make an optical fool of you, and sticky lines stretched above the terraces to trap filaments at known times. Collect: handle with nitrile gloves, jar aliquots dry, jar aliquots in ethanol, keep 1 sample unhandled. Analyze: FDIR, protein versus silicate, SEM for fiber cross-section and surface texture. Spider silk shows characteristic fibrillar ridges, glass shows extrusion striations. An amino acid analysis for glycine, alanine, serine dominance, spider silk, versus nothing like that for glass. Run a burn test outside a clean hood. Spider silk shrivels and smells like hair. Fiberglass melts into little beads and smells like boredom and binders. If you want to be maximalist, do LCMS MS on peptids and match against known spider fibrin sequences from Lignophiidae. Do a quick isotopic look, 13C, 15N, for biological signatures. Document everything with timestamps, GPS positions in the stadium, so later you can tie wind field to where the silk draped, and the angle of the sun at each sample. Then go to press with a sentence that has mercy on listeners. It was spiders and sunlight and the world's cheapest spectrometer, not a fleet of spindles with tailor's waist. Conspiracy culture, naturally, chose door number 3, fiberglass from propulsion systems. The idea's charm is its plausibility vocabulary: borosilicate, filament, radioactivity, engine exhaust. But engines that make glass wool in free air are engines that ingest silicate and exhale it as spun fiber, an energy budget that makes no sense for a machine that also has to fly. If an aircraft dumps insulation, it doesn't choose a stadium in Florence at the same minute that ballooning conditions are textbook and the entire city is already looking up because sports did it a favor. And if a secret craft coughs a sheet of fibers, those fibers won't evaporate when touched. They'll itch, embed, and send 100 Tuscans to bed complaining about their wrists. The 1959 Evora, Portugal episode. Angel hair collected, later claimed under a microscope to be living organisms, is the poster child for why lab hygiene matters. Fungal hyphae and drying artifacts on slides in poorly controlled rooms look like a new kingdom if you're tired and your microscope has spent a lifetime dreaming of better operators. A good method is not a buzzkill. It is the only way out of the romance versus ridicule duel that ruins every civic conversation about anomalies. Meanwhile, the meat genre keeps inviting the wrong villains. Waterspouts can lift fish, we will get to that in excruciating detail when we do animal rains, but they do not generate scattered handfuls of unskinned mammal flesh without any associated aquatic debris, shells, or vegetation. If a vortex crosses a stockyard waste pit, yes, you might sample statistics that smell like a butcher's floor. You would also smell the pit and find paper, straw, flies. Bath County in 1876 had none of that. Flesh fell on a small set of properties near Olympia Springs. The witness who looked up saw no cloud in the place storytellers want clouds most, and the meteorology of the day makes vultures louder than any alternative. The best physical rebuttal of waterspout of meat is in the meat itself. The alveoli pattern seen by Edwards is mammalian. The cartilage described by Arnold implies an animal body. There is no marine signature, no fish scales, nothing to excuse a column of water from the nearest creek. Birds are the engine. Gravity is the courier. Human appetite for theatre is the applause track. A short, rude sidebar on star jelly, because mix-ups between it and angel hair are a recurring sin. Nastark communes is a cyanobacterium that lives as a tough, dehydrated film. When rain arrives, the polysaccharide matrix hydrates, swells, and becomes clear, quivering masses that the unwary call jelly from the stars. Pick it up, and it dissolves in your hand over minutes because you're stirring, not because it sublimates. Microscopically it is nothing like spider silk and nothing like connective tissue. Yet 19th century columns and 20th century UFO books shuffle terms like cards, angel hair, star jelly, meat shower, jellies from the sky. Method cures language. A wet mount and a 10 times objective would have saved 100 bad headlines. A protein stain would have saved 1,000. If you want to see how modern anomalies should be handled, imitate the oceanographers and the radio astronomers who learned to catalogue their surprises into extinction. Specify the instrument. Specify the geometry. Build testable predictions. For angel hair, if spider silk is the father, then its amino acid profile will be glycine rich, its Raman spectrum will show amide bands, And on a dry day the fibers will take charge in an electric field like poor man's electrodes. If glass is the father, it will have none of those and will melt into beads at modest flame. For meat showers, if vultures did it, you will find bile salts, avian digestive enzymes, and possibly stomach acid residues. The distribution will align with a flight path inferred from witnesses and wind. There will be no weather radar signature of a vortex, and the local carrion inventory will suggest what was eaten. And if you return empty on every essay, no protein, no glass, no bile, then you have something new and you have earned your claim. Most new things evaporate under this light. A precious few don't. That residue is the oxygen we owe curiosity. The social mechanics are the most depressing and the funniest portion of these files. Kentucky 1876 gave us a half-dozen citizens with good eyes and no lenses, 3 or 4 professionals with microscopes and a reputation to defend, and a press that pivoted from auto-sarcasm to amnesia in 2 weeks. Florence 1954 gave us thousands of witnesses whose attention was synchronized, a rare and precious human instrument, plus a handful of samples, then a news cycle that couldn't decide if it liked spiders or Martians more, and settled on both because the copydesk needed a Sunday feature. In both, the official response was, "We looked," which, translated into method, means, we wrote down our feelings and forgot to pre-register what would falsify them. If you think that's unique to the mid-century, take a stroll through any modern municipal hearing about mysterious fibers, or chemical trails. We still prefer narrative closure to sampling plans, press conferences to spectra, a charismatic witness to a capillary column. The fix is a little contempt and a lot of kits, cheap portable FTIRs, basic microscopes, a one-page field protocol that teaches a city desk to be a lab bench in a pinch. We will never stop having anomalies, we can stop having stupid ones. One last historical tour to round out the genre's edges. Italy and France were not the only angel hair nations, and Kentucky's sky didn't have a monopoly on meat. New Zealanders in 1955 grumbled about snowfall of silk over Blenheim just after a front. The papers printed, mystery substance, because headlines must eat. Entomologists said, erigone, the linified genus that also owns the English word gossamer. The case rotted in an archive because it was solved. The Iberian Peninsula had its 1959 Evora business. The Portuguese Air Force sent officers. The bishop sent opinions. The lab sent organisms, because contaminated slides are the devil's playground. The US Midwest had occasional meat flakes in small towns where the likeliest culprit, again, turns out to be a combination of scavenging birds and a human unwillingness to consider guts when the sky is available. Conspiracists will try to enroll rocket re-entry producing glass fibers as an occasional father of angel hair. Material scientists will point out that re-entries spray droplets that quench into beads and plates. Yes, but you get grit and glass rain near debris fields, not miles of synchronized threads over a stadium with the timing of a halftime show. Mother Nature is a habitual, not a dramatist. If the point of anomalies is to get us to tighten our instruments and loosen our egos, these 2 Skyfalls have done their job for a century and a half. A modern replay in Florence would be less mystery and more measurement, a pair of synchronized cameras on the tribunes, a pocket spectrometer in the photographer's bag, a field entomologist on a scooter next to the turnstiles, a baseball cap full of silk retained in ethanol for the morning and an aliquot burned at dusk, everyone satisfied not because a senator held a press conference but because an amide band rose where proteins always rise. A modern replay in Kentucky would be less sermon and more biology, a wildlife biologist who knows a vulture's puke radius the way you know your commute, a lab with bile assays that don't sleep, and a small Fairchild-like joy in writing, "It was birds," in a font too big for the headline. The fun isn't killing legends, it's making them earn their pension with numbers. By the time the story reached the men with microscopes, the romance had already congealed into folklore. The slides did not care. In Louisville in 1876, Leopold Kastenbein, the physician-editor type who could keep a clinic and a journal running on the same coffee, took a sliver of the Bath County fall, cut it as thin as thumb skill allowed, and reported alveoli clear enough to make a 19th-century lens blush. Alveolar diameters at 2 to 3/10 of a millimeter, bronchioles with cartilage, striated muscle fibers lying like threads. The catalogue reads like Anatomy 101 for meat that pretended to be a meteor. A. Meade Edwards, a Newark microscopist with a foot in entomology and another in medicine, looked and said essentially the same thing: lung tissue, muscular tissue, connective tissue, each with microtexture that no plant and no gelatinous Nastock colony could counterfeit without bribing histology. Different pieces were different organs, some were pinkish lobes with their spaces, some were the red of skeletal muscle with tidy striations, and at least one had a glistening firmness that suggested cartilage from a trachea or joint. Whatever fell was not unearthly and not uniform. It was a butcher's inventory spread by altitude and wind into a footprint roughly 100 meters across, an oval the size any thunderstorm would be proud to drop hail into. The two villagers who famously tasted the mystery, one said mutton, one said venison, which is what two palates will say about the same animal when panic has lent the seasoning. We're doing a version of 1870s spectroscopy with teeth. The slides did the grown-up version and found cells that matched mammal. If you want a narrative the lung knows how to tell, it is someone ate an animal and then changed their mind above a farm. The vulture argument, on the other hand, looks absurd until you write it as ethology instead of insult. Black vultures and turkey vultures feed in flocks when offal and carrion are concentrated. They defend themselves and lighten load by projectile regurgitation that can expel hundreds of grams of partially digested meat in a single event. They do it in air when spooked. And March in Kentucky is offal season because hog killing in the cold months fills fence lines with lungs and trimmings by the bucket. A scattered flock over Bath County on March 3rd fits the map. Scavengers over a slaughter day, a dog barks, a shot goes off, a gusty midday breeze bumps a wedge of birds into one another. The oldest solution in the vulture handbook, jettison, plays out in a quick, embarrassing shower. Select for the soft parts. Lung tears away from vertebra more easily than round, and you've just engineered the organ-level diversity the slides recorded. Updraft plus horizontal wind marks out the scatter, an elongated footprint oriented roughly with the school line. That moved through the county that week, largest pieces dropping first because terminal velocity scales with mass and cross-section, lighter alveolar tufts sailing farther. That the fragments landed in a pasture while the sky was blue over other hamlets is not a veto on weather. It is a lesson in the small scale of gusts, in the way a convective boundary can be a line on one farm and a rumor on the next. None of that makes a good headline, all of it makes a better mechanism than the superheated imagination of anonymous star jelly. But this is Kentucky in the 1870s, and the files have other voices. A local correspondent recorded that the pieces measured flakes 2 to 3 inches across, as if someone had shaved a roast across the grain and then teleported it into the air. A neighbor swore it fell like large snowflakes, which is what a brain eager for analogy will say about any low-velocity precipitation that lacks a drama coach. No one saw the source because people don't look up until sound tells them to, and vomit does not come with thunder. The tasting, the laughter, the embarrassment, all of it is field anthropology, how a community metabolizes a grotesque surprise. The sheriff counted nothing because that was not his job. The doctors did what they could do with lenses that forgave sins, and their write-ups, if you translate the 19th century calm, say clogged pump, not cosmic riddle. Vultures leave a lot of biology in their wake that never makes it to newspapers, droppings with uric acid that whites the roof of any barn where a roost goes on for a season, the particular acid smell that tells the nose the carcass is older than the flies admit, the splay of feathers at a plucking site that marks who got there first. A meat shower just takes those ordinary signatures and puts them aloft, where 1876 had no doctrine for them. Charles Fort did. He did not accept the vulture solution because Fort's genius and vice were the same. He disliked endings. In the Book of the Damned he files the Bath County incident amid fish falls, frog rains, and gelatinous cinders from British skies. He dares you not to think about a Super Sargasso Sea, where terrestrial oddments are stored and occasionally decanted. It is intended as audacity more than model, a philosophical middle finger pointed at the habit of filing anomalies away under one column, error, hoax, bad weather, just to keep textbooks tidy. Fort quotes microscopists like Castenbein, tips his hat in one sentence, and then returns to his thesis by tone if not by footnote, that the sky is not merely an optical dome but a highway with cargo. His timing made him a literary weathervane. His temperament still misleads copy editors into thinking he wanted angels where vultures do the job. The more adult reading is to see Fort as the patron saint of the unfiled. He is not the enemy of explanations, he is their auditor, and the Bath County meet is a page in his ledger reminding us that a thing can be funny, disgusting, and solvable without becoming trivial. The Florence episode Half a World and 8 Decades Away earns the same audit, except it rains silk instead of protein and drags a stadium into the file. What thousands of people saw in Tuscany on 27 October 1954 was doubly theatrical. First the bright objects moving in blue autumn air over the city, then the angel hair, white filaments that drifted in skeins over rooftops and cypresses, that collapsed in the hand into gluey clots, that vanished as if embarrassed by touch. Laboratory men at the University of Florence put samples over a Bunsen flame and saw them sublimate rather than burn like cotton. They noted a smell more like singed hair than like paper. They dissolved a trace in solvents and left behind salts that did not steady the hand. The city's own rumor mill did the rest. Something in the sky had shed a skin, and the skin did not behave like web. The opportune fever of 1954, France that same autumn reporting Oloron and Gale-Lac, with aerial cigars, preceding falls of fibrils, gave the story international legs and decades of television. Put the threads under a modern microscope and the romance strips away just enough to make a biologist smile. Mass ballooning of Linniphiidae spiders in temperate autumns produces skyfalls of silk measured in grams per square meter when conditions align, high-pressure days with light winds, a weak electric field between ground and air that encourages charge separation, and juveniles erupting from egg sacs in numbers large enough that entire meadows look snow-dusted by noon. A single spiderling can extrude dozens of nanoscale to micrometer-scale filaments from cribellate or acrobellate spigots. Those filaments braid in air into visible floss. Add a light breeze and a few square kilometers of farmland can loft billions of microthreads at once. Static loads on silk are non-trivial. Experiments in the last decade have shown spiders launch in the absence of wind by sensing the atmospheric potential gradient, the same fair weather field lightning loves to ruin, and paying out fiber that repels itself into a triangular fan. It is not romantic to say that the Tuscan sky on that Thursday hosted a biological cloud. It is faithful to what anyone watching a migration front of spiderlings across Emilia-Romagna can catch in a jar before lunch. The two qualities witnesses in Florence swore by, the way the stuff dissolved when handled and the short lifetime of the deposit, are features, not bugs, in spider physics. Ballooning silk is extruded in thin, non-core sheath filaments that can be crushed into nothing but oil on skin and static on wall. In air at 20 to 24 degrees Celsius and 30 to 50% relative humidity, protein fibers of micrometer diameter cling, knot, and vanish as discrete threads in seconds under friction, leaving a smear that does not look like fiber at all. So too the sublimation over a flame, fine silk vanishes with a small exotherm, contracting and then oxidizing without the fluffy flame cotton delivers, and it leaves almost no ash because protein, not cellulose, is paying the bill. Add the observational theater, a soccer match interrupted, the word discs and cigars on people's tongues because it is 1954 on the Italian peninsula and everybody knows somebody who saw something over the Po Valley, and you do not need extraterrestrials to explain filaments. You need spiders and optics and crowds. Other explanations have auditioned over the years and failed their chemistry exams. Radar chaff. Aluminum-coated glass fibers of calibrated lengths, has a persistence, a metallic shine under the loupe, and a short length distribution that do not match kilometer-long skyfalls of fragile, proteinaceous threads. Plant flocculence, poplar seed down, cartonwood fluff, burns like a politician's promise and peers like a plant under cross-polarized light. Ionized polymers from UFOs is a story about effects without sources, a kind of chemistry by wish. A better test than any editorial is the countryside itself. Mass gossamer events are reported by farmers long before urban newspapers find adjectives, and specimens collected by board school teachers in Australia, Italy, Kansas, and New South Wales that autumn and every autumn since behave the same in mason jars and under loops. The Florence story is special because the sky gave a two-act play. It is ordinary because nature repeats. If you want a forensic update, write the lab orders we cannot send back in time. For Bath County, histology with H&D would have settled organ identity non-poetically in an afternoon. Collagen cross link patterns would have dated the age of the tissue relative to the kill. Proteomics would have put a species name on it by peptid mouse fingerprints even if nucleic acids were gone. Stable isotopes in the meat could have told you whether the source animal ate C3 pasture or C4 fodder. For Florence, FTIR and Raman on fibers would have put protein on the page where cellulose and aluminosilicate sometimes try to sneak. LCMS of amino acid composition would have nailed the silk to an orb-weaver genome. Scanning electron microscopy would have shown the ribboned morphology of cribellate silk or the smooth cylinder of its acrobellate cousins. A few milligrams would have turned into a paper with a date and a species list. Vulture stomach contents sampled on late winter Kentucky abattoirs would have given a control for the meat's partial digestion state and pH. Collecting casts from startled birds in the field would have let one measure fragment dispersion under a 10 meters per second gust. The adult in all of this is not the microscope, it is the discipline to plan the questions before the next anomaly auditions. Fort would have insisted on that discipline while chuckling at it. He would have quoted our inventories back to us and said, "See how quickly explanations become furniture," and he would be right. The danger for the sober investigator is to turn a satisfying mechanism into a new superstition, vultures forever, spiders forever, so that you stop listening for the rare deviation that earns a new file folder. The correct posture is a raised eyebrow with a toolkit in hand, Kentucky gets vultures because the histology says lung and the ecology says offal season. Florence gets spiders because protein threads behave like protein threads and because lignophiidae make their own weathers. But then you ask, where else does protein fall from the sky? And why did journals in 1894 print, Jellyfall, when a cyanobacterial mat rehydrated on a heathy hillside and became a salmon? You run the same play on the angel hair of Oloron and Gaolac, on the 1959 filaments over Evora in Portugal, on the childlike piles of star jelly after autumn rains in Wales, and you discover that each class of marvel is actually 3 or 4 cousins wearing a single face. The conspiracists have already tried to recruit both episodes for their parade. Chemtrails gets invoked for angel hair as if a contrail turned into lace. It does not, because contrails are ice crystals laid at 8 to 12 kilometers in air colder than -40, and silk does not form where kerosene exhaust produces water and soot. Mesh at lamp post height does not condense out of aviation lanes. The meat in Kentucky becomes an early, biological experiment for the imaginative. It does not, because defense research does not drop transient organ slivers across a single farm at midday and then leave nothing that matches any catalogue of military mischief. What these theories get right is that fear loves a villain with an address. What they get wrong is that physics loves gradients more than actors. The enemies and saviors in these tales are the elements, the animals, the texture of human attention. We can build better nets than the 1870s and 1950s had. In some places, we have. Off Cambridgeshire and in the wheat belts of South Australia, field ecologists have installed cheap all-sky cameras and particulate samplers that catch ballooning days as skyborne fallout. A 2-sensor parallax baseline of 200 meters will put most angel hair within a kilometer. In raptor country, GPS backpacks and accelerometers on vultures log pitch and vomit events. Yes, a gut has a kinematics, well enough that one could, in principle, reconstruct the day a flock shed a meal over a county road. In the low Earth orbit era, ADS-B receivers on kitchen counters let a citizen exclude aircraft on the night a sky becomes loud with rumor. Dual-pol weather radar will show if the sky held insects or fibers because electromagnetic scattering at centimeter wavelengths gives different polarimetric signatures for chitin and droplets. Each instrument attaches a leash to a class of error. Each also manufactures a new one, which is why the friendliest sentence in modern anomalistics is not, case closed, but, show me your data. When you line up the two stories, protein rain in 1876, gossamer rain in 1954, they turn into a lecture on how our heads work. In Bath County, taste and disgust edited testimony before the first editor did. By the time men in coats arrived, the villagers had fashioned a genre, flakes, mutton, a sky that disobeyed. In Florence, a stadium turned thousands of eyes into a metronome, one gasp multiplies into 10 into a public event, and the cognitive afterimage of motion can take a small white bead in a slate sky and turn it into a disc, when your rods, not your cones, are on duty. The science fixes the pieces, but the culture writes the headline. That is not an indictment of witnesses, it is a map of how society measures what it cannot bench test. Fort's trick was to enjoy that map while still issuing subpoenas to the Sun. There is a quieter moral that the Bath County pasture and the Artemio Franchi pitch share with any honest investigation. A solved case keeps a little rune of mystery if you're paying attention. Even knowing vulture vomit, you can still blink at the image of a blue Kentucky sky spotted like the floor of a butcher's shop. Even knowing ballooning silk, you can still feel a tremor when an entire city stops because the air seems briefly alive. Skepticism without wonder is just good posture. Wonder without skepticism is just theater. The sweet spot is messy, lab coat energy applied to absurdity, careful dates married to irreverent jokes, a file drawer that holds both lung histology and a field note about men tasting sky meat like idiots. A century and a half from now, the pasture and the stadium will be wired as if the planet had grown a nervous system on purpose. Microlidar over farm belts will profile insect and silk densities by altitude in 5-meter slices. Atmospheric electric field monitors on weather masts will predict spider launches like tide tables. Raptors will ping their own GPS as they take off, vomit, and land, turning a scavenger's gut into a public log. Post-Fortean databases will timestamp and parallax everything the way seismologists log aftershocks, and a museum will hold a Bath County scrap in a vial readable for proton and isotope, the way we now read a shard of bone for ancient diet. The old Fortean romance won't die, it will find a better partner in method. The slogan will be the same as it is quietly now, don't be boring, even when you have the answer. And then the old man in the library returns, because endings belong to people who write better lines than we do. Fort would pat the Kentucky file and the Tuscany file and tell us what he told everyone, the damned are what you exile to protect your story. He would want us to protect fewer stories and keep more facts. He would tell us, with a mean little grin, that vultures and spiders are more beautiful than saucers and Super Sargasso seas when you look long enough, because they leave evidence and teach you how to see. He would tell us to laugh at ourselves, at the tasting, at the stadium's halt, at the scientist who is a hair too proud of his microscope, and then to go outside the next time someone says the sky is misbehaving and bring an instrument we'll be embarrassed not to have. He would not have let us end with a sermon, he would have insisted on a punchline. So here's one: the universe threw meat and lace at us, and we built a subject out of cleaning up after it. That is not a humiliation, that is a field.